Both engines were gone at 24,000 feet. Not one engine sputtered. Not, we'll make an emergency landing. I mean gone, like someone ripped the heart out of the plane and threw it into the sky. The cockpit alarms screamed. The nose dipped. The whole aircraft shuddered as if it had been punched by something invisible. And behind that cockpit door, 198 people were still sipping soda, scrolling phones, laughing, because they didn't know the truth yet. They were no longer flying. They were falling, just falling with style. Captain Renee Harper gripped the controls so hard her knuckles turned white. Her eyes snapped across the panel, numbers, lights, warnings stacking on top of each other like a nightmare that wouldn't stop growing. Restart, come on, First Officer Dylan Cross muttered, hands moving fast, flipping switches the way he'd done 100 times in simulators. But the engines didn't respond. No roar. No spool up. No recovery. Just that horrifying, unnatural silence that only exists when a jet becomes a glider. Then Dylan's gaze flicked over his shoulder, and froze. Because strapped into the jump seat behind them was a tiny girl in an oversized space agency hoodie, the sleeves rolled up like she was wearing her dad's jacket. Big glasses. Tight braids. Calm eyes that didn't look like a kid's eyes. They looked like someone who had already solved the problem. Dylan's mouth opened, but no words came out at first. Like his brain needed a second to accept what his eyes were seeing. "Captain," he whispered. Renee didn't look away from the instruments. "Not now." "No, Captain, look." Renee turned her head, just enough to see the hoodie patch. And in that split second, something changed in Dylan's face, recognition mixed with shock, like he'd just seen a ghost walk into the cockpit. "That hoodie," he said, voice tight. "I've seen that patch before. I've heard the stories." Renee's heartbeat slammed in her ears. "Dylan, what are you talking about?" He swallowed, eyes still locked on the child. "That's not just a hoodie. That belonged to call sign, Viper." The name landed in the cockpit like a second explosion. Renee's eyes widened. Even she had heard of Viper. Every pilot who ever trained seriously had. The test pilot who flew broken aircraft on purpose. The man who took disasters into the sky and dragged them back down alive. Dylan's voice dropped to a harsh, urgent whisper. "That kid, she's his daughter." The little girl didn't panic. Didn't cry. She simply looked at the dead engine readings, then at the horizon, like she was measuring distance with her eyes. Renee's throat went dry. "How old are you?" The girl answered with a calm that felt impossible inside a dying plane. 11. Dylan turned back to Renee, his face pale. "We have no thrust. No power. No second chances." He glanced at the girl again, like fate had personally delivered her into their cockpit. "Captain." Renee's hands trembled on the yoke. Then Dylan said the words that should have been insane, except nothing else made sense anymore. "Call sign Viper's daughter," he breathed. "We need this kid." And right then, out in the cabin, someone laughed at a joke. Someone asked for more ice. Someone had no idea the next few minutes would decide whether they ever saw their family again. Because this wasn't just a plane emergency anymore. This was a story about a promise, a dead father's training, and an 11-year-old girl who might be the only reason 198 people make it home. Before I continue, comment below which country you're watching from, and if you want more real, cinematic stories like this, hit subscribe right now, because what happens next is unbelievable. 2 years earlier. The desert sky burned gold and crimson as the sun slid down behind the dry mountains of southern Nevada. The runway shimmered in the fading heat, stretching out like a long silver blade cutting through the sand. The air smelled like dust, jet fuel, and something electric, like the sky itself was waiting. At the edge of runway 18 stood Colonel Aaron Maddox. Pilots across the Air Force knew him by a different name. Call sign, Viper. He wasn't just any pilot. He was the one they called when a jet came back broken. When flight systems glitched. When engineers needed to know if a damaged aircraft could still be saved, or if it would kill the next person who climbed inside. Aaron flew planes that weren't supposed to fly. He disabled systems on purpose. He tested failures mid-air. He pushed machines to the edge of death, and brought them home. And standing beside him, holding his hand tightly, was his 10-year-old daughter, Aria Maddox. She was small for her age, barely tall enough to reach his elbow. Dark hair tied into 2 neat braids her mother had done that morning. Big round glasses that slipped down her nose every few minutes. And over her thin shoulders hung an oversized navy hoodie with a faded National Space Research Center patch sewn on the sleeve. It had once belonged to her father. Now it looked like she was drowning inside it. But she wore it like armor. In the distance, a gray stealth fighter sat on the runway, gleaming under the dying sun. "Dad," Aria asked quietly, her voice almost carried away by the desert wind. "Why do you keep flying planes that are broken?" Aaron didn't answer right away. The wind tugged gently at his flight suit. The patches on his chest told a story of years in the sky, combat ribbons, test pilot school insignias, flight hours that most men could never imagine surviving. "Mom says it's too dangerous," Aria continued softly. "She says you've already proven enough." Aaron knelt down so they were face to face. Up close, his eyes were steady. Calm. The kind of calm that didn't come from fearlessness, but from training. "Someone has to," he said gently. "If engineers don't know exactly how a plane fails, they can't fix it. If pilots don't practice disasters, they freeze when they happen for real." He placed his hand over her small chest. "Training beats fear. Preparation beats panic." Aria looked back at the fighter jet. "But what if it doesn't work one day? What if you don't come back?" The question hung in the air between them. Aaron smiled, not a careless smile. A careful one. "That's why I train until my hands move before my brain can panic," he said. "When something goes wrong at 30,000 feet, there's no time to think about being scared. You just act." He tapped her forehead lightly. "Knowledge saves lives. Not bravery." Aria's eyes didn't leave his. "I want to learn." The words came out suddenly. Fast. Like they'd been waiting. "I want to know what you know. I want to understand engines. And glide paths. And what to do when everything goes wrong." She swallowed. "I don't just want to watch you fly, Dad. I want to be able to save one." Aaron studied her face carefully. This wasn't hero worship. This wasn't a little kid pretending. There was something sharp in her eyes. Focused. Hungry to understand. He saw himself at that age. And in that moment, standing under a sky that looked almost too beautiful to be real, Colonel Aaron Viper Maddox made a decision that would change everything. A decision that could destroy his career. Break federal laws. End his license. Maybe even send him to prison. He leaned closer and lowered his voice. "If I teach you," he said quietly, "it stays between us." Aria nodded instantly. "Your mother can't know. The Air Force can't know. No one." Her voice was steady. "I won't tell." He hesitated for only one more second. Then he said the words that would shape the next 3 years of her life. "All right. I'll teach you everything." The fighter jet in the distance powered up, engines roaring to life. Aaron stood back up, looking out at the runway. "One day," he added softly, almost to himself, "you might just be a passenger on a normal plane. Sitting quietly. No one noticing you." He looked down at her again. "And something might go wrong." Aria didn't blink. "And when everyone else freezes," he finished, "you'll know what to do." The jet thundered down the runway and lifted into the glowing sky. And neither of them knew that the promise made in that desert sunset would one day hold 198 lives in its hands. It started the very next weekend. Not with a big announcement. Not with a dramatic speech. Just a quiet drive before sunrise. Aaron told his wife he had extra simulator work. That wasn't a complete lie. He did have access to simulators. He just didn't mention who would be sitting in the other seat. At 5:10 a.m., a small pickup truck rolled down a cracked desert road toward a forgotten airstrip surrounded by nothing but sand and silence. Inside the truck, Arya held a notebook in her lap. On the front, in neat handwriting, she had written, "Flight log, private." Aaron parked beside a weathered hangar. An old single-engine trainer aircraft waited outside, tied down against the wind. It wasn't a fighter jet. It wasn't fast. It wasn't glamorous. It was perfect. Aaron turned to her. "Before we ever leave the ground," he said, "you learn the ground." And that became the rule. For weeks, she didn't even touch the controls in the air. She learned instruments first. Airspeed. Altitude. Vertical speed. Attitude indicator. She learned what normal looked like, because you can't recognize wrong if you don't understand right. He made her calculate fuel burn manually with a calculator. He made her measure weight and balance with pencil and paper. He made her plan routes using paper charts instead of relying on screens. If she made a mistake, he didn't get angry. He just made her do it again. And again. And again. Muscle memory, he would say. When your brain panics, your hands shouldn't. After 3 months, he let her taxi the plane. After 6 months, she held the yoke during climb. By the end of year 1, she could keep altitude within 50 feet and heading within 2 degrees. But that wasn't what made the training dangerous. What made it dangerous was what happened at night. Once a month, long after everyone else had gone home, Aaron used favors he had built over decades. Old friends. Former engineers. A retired instructor who didn't ask questions. Inside a dimly lit simulator facility, Arya sat in a full cockpit mock-up that normally cost thousands of dollars per hour to operate. At first, she thought it was the coolest thing she had ever seen. Then her father shut down both engines at 28,000 feet. The screens went dark. Alarms screamed. And he said calmly, "Fix it." The first time, she froze. The second time, she cried. The third time, she lasted longer. By the 10th session, her hands moved before she consciously decided to move them. He trained her on everything most pilots never experience outside of nightmares. Engine fires. Electrical failures. Total communication loss. Severe turbulence. Forced landings on highways. Night descents with no instruments. Dual engine flameout at cruise altitude. That last one became his obsession. He programmed it over and over. Different altitudes. Different aircraft weights. Different weather conditions. Sometimes he added crosswinds. Sometimes low visibility. Sometimes a runway barely long enough. Again, he'd say. 40 times. 41. 42. She began to understand something terrifying. Her father wasn't teaching her like a hobby. He was preparing her for something specific. One night, after she completed a near-perfect powerless glide into a simulated runway, Aaron didn't reset the scenario. He just sat there quietly in the instructor's chair. The simulator lights reflected off his flight suit. "You're not learning this for fun," he said finally. Arya looked at him. "Then why?" He leaned forward. "Because someday, somewhere, something is going to fail at altitude. And the professionals might freeze." She felt a chill even though the room was warm. "They'll be trained," she said. "Yes," he replied. "But training isn't enough if panic wins." He studied her carefully. You won't panic. It wasn't a compliment. It was a statement. 2 years into their secret, Arya had logged more real control time than many licensed adults. She could calculate glide ratios in her head. She knew optimal airspeeds for different weights. She could perform emergency checklists from memory. And still, no one knew. Not her school. Not her mother. Not the Air Force. If anyone discovered the truth, Aaron's career would end instantly. But he kept going. Because deep down, he felt something he couldn't explain. A quiet certainty. Like he wasn't just training his daughter. He was preparing her for a specific day. A specific aircraft. A specific moment. And as the third year of training began, Aaron programmed the dual-engine failure scenario one more time. He looked at her across the dark simulator cockpit and said words that would echo long after he was gone. When the moment comes, you won't have time to think about me. He paused. You'll just remember. It started with weekends. Not playgrounds. Not cartoons. Not birthday parties. Runways. At first, it was small airstrips far from the main base. Quiet places where the desert wind erased footprints and no one asked too many questions. Aaron had old friends, retired pilots, mechanics who owed him favors, men who respected Viper enough to look the other way. Arya didn't sit in the back seat like a child. She sat up front. Her feet barely reached the rudder pedals, so her father installed temporary extensions. Her hands looked tiny wrapped around the yoke, but they didn't shake. Light hands, he would say. The airplane talks. You just listen. At 9 years old, she learned to taxi in crosswinds. At 10, she practiced engine-out procedures over empty desert land. At 11, she could calculate fuel burn in her head faster than most licensed pilots could with a calculator. She didn't just fly. She studied. Her bedroom wasn't decorated with posters of pop stars. It was covered in approach charts, glide ratio tables, emergency checklists taped neatly along the wall. She kept notebooks filled with weight and balance math, drawn perfectly straight with ruler and pencil. Every page had one sentence written at the top. Preparation beats panic. Her father drilled it into her like a commandment. Again. Engine failure at 5,000 feet. Again. Electrical blackout at night. Again. Lost communications. Again. Fire warning simulation. He never praised too early. Never smiled too wide. He trained her the way he trained himself, like someday, it would matter. Because deep down, he believed it would. Then came the night that changed the tone of everything. 2 months before his final test flight, Aaron drove Arya to a secured training facility outside Seattle. It was after midnight. The building lights were dim. The parking lot was almost empty. Inside was something most airline pilots only touched after years of training. A full-motion commercial jet simulator. Not a toy. Not a video game. A machine that moved, tilted, shook, and reacted exactly like a real Boeing 737 in the sky. Aaron had called in every favor he had left. Pulled every connection. Signed papers he probably shouldn't have signed. And when the simulator door closed, and the hydraulic systems powered up, Arya felt the cockpit come alive beneath her. Aaron programmed one scenario. Dual engine failure at cruise altitude. Not once. Not twice. Dozens of times. Different weather. Different weights. Different altitudes. Different distances to the nearest runway. Each time, the engines died at 24,000 feet. Each time, the plane became a silent glider. And each time, he watched her hands. At first, she hesitated. Just a second. Just enough for fear to flicker. Don't freeze, he would say calmly from the instructor seat. Trust the math. So she learned to calculate glide distance before the alarms even stopped ringing. She learned optimal airspeed profiles. When to delay gear extension. When to hold flaps clean. How to stretch every mile out of thin air. By the 20th run, her voice stopped shaking. By the 30th, she stopped asking questions. By the 43rd attempt, she could bring the powerless jet down through clouds, align perfectly with the runway, and touch down with barely any margin left, like she had done it her whole life. The simulator went still. The screens faded dark. Aaron unbuckled slowly and stepped into the cockpit beside her. He didn't speak for several seconds. Then he placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "Listen to me carefully," he said. She turned toward him. "You're going to be better than me." Her eyes widened. He wasn't joking. "But the world won't let you prove it yet," he continued. "You're too young. The rules won't allow it. So you wait. You study. You stay sharp." He paused. And something in his expression changed. It wasn't pride anymore. It was certainty. "One day," he said quietly, "you'll be on a plane when something impossible happens. The kind of thing that makes grown pilots look at each other and think, this is it." Arya felt her chest tighten. "And when that moment comes, everyone else might freeze." He leaned closer. "But you won't." She searched his face. "How do you know that moment will come?" Aaron's eyes drifted toward the dark simulator windshield. "I don't know how," he admitted. "But I feel it. And I trust that feeling." He squeezed her shoulder gently. "When it happens, remember everything. Every calculation. Every drill. Every correction I ever made." His voice lowered almost to a whisper. "Save them." Outside, the wind rattled the building softly. Inside, under the dim lights of an empty simulator facility, a father planted a prophecy in his daughter's heart. Neither of them knew how soon that prophecy would begin moving toward reality. But somewhere, far in the future, at exactly 24,000 feet, 2 engines would die. And a promise would wake up. The sky over the desert was clear that morning. Too clear. The kind of perfect blue that made everything feel safe. Colonel Aaron Viper Maddox had flown in worse weather. Stronger winds. Lower visibility. Harder missions. This one was supposed to be controlled. Routine, by his standards. A high-altitude test run in a modified stealth fighter. Engineers needed data on a newly adjusted engine system. There had been minor vibration reports during ground testing, but nothing outside acceptable limits. Aaron reviewed the briefing with his usual calm precision. He signed the paperwork. He suited up. Before walking to the jet, he checked his phone. One unread message. From Arya. "Be safe. Don't forget, training beats fear." He smiled. Typed back. "Always." Then he climbed into the cockpit. At 40,000 feet, the world looks small. The desert becomes a faded map. The sky feels endless. Aaron ran through the checklist methodically. System stable. Engine readings within tolerance. Control surfaces responsive. Then, without warning, the vibration needle jumped. Just slightly at first. He noticed it instantly. Of course he did. Viper didn't miss patterns. "Control, this is Viper. I'm seeing unexpected oscillation in engine 2. Monitoring." His voice was steady. Almost bored. The vibration spiked again. Then again. A sharp metallic whine cut through the headset. And then. Boom. Not a loud explosion like in the movies. Something worse. A deep mechanical rupture that felt like the aircraft had torn its own heart apart. The engine disintegrated. Flames burst along the fuselage. Warning lights flooded the cockpit red. The aircraft jerked violently, rolling sideways as systems failed one after another. Aaron's hands didn't hesitate. Fuel cut off. Fire suppression. Attempted restart. Negative response. Altitude dropping fast. Control, engine catastrophic failure. Total flameout. Attempting recovery. He fought the stick with controlled strength, stabilizing what he could. But this wasn't like the simulations. This wasn't like the drills. Debris had damaged more than just the engine. Hydraulics began failing. Control response grew sluggish. He calculated quickly. He wasn't going to save the jet. But he could save himself. Ejection sequence armed. He aligned the aircraft as best as possible to avoid populated areas below. Even now, even seconds from disaster, he was protecting strangers. Control, ejecting now. A beat of silence. Then, quieter. Tell my wife I love her. Another breath. Tell my daughter, she's ready. The canopy blasted away. The ejection seat fired. For a brief second, Aaron Maddox was above the chaos, separated from the dying machine. Then gravity took over. The parachute deployed. And malfunctioned. Lines tangled. Canopy twisted. There wasn't enough altitude left. 40,000 feet feels high. It isn't high enough when silk fails. Aaron Viper Maddox fell into the desert he had flown over 1,000 times. And this time, the sky did not give him back. The funeral was quiet. Too quiet. Full military honors. Folded flag. Gun salute. Arya stood beside her mother in a child-sized dress uniform the Air Force had prepared for her. The oversized space agency hoodie was under it. She refused to take it off. Wind moved gently across the cemetery. Bugle notes echoed across rows of white stone. She didn't cry during the ceremony. Not once. She stood straight. Saluted when they told her to. Watched as the flag was folded with perfect precision. When it was placed in her mother's hands, Arya's fingers tightened around the edge of her hoodie sleeve. That night, long after everyone had gone home, she walked back to his grave alone. The desert air was cold now. Very different from that golden sunset years before. She knelt. Placed her small hand against the headstone. You said the moment would come, she whispered. Her voice shook, but she didn't stop. You said everyone would freeze. Tears finally slid down her face, silent and steady. I won't. She closed her eyes. I remember everything. A deep breath. I'll save them. The wind passed softly over the cemetery. And somewhere beyond the quiet night, the future was already moving toward her. 2 years and 6 months later. A perfect autumn afternoon. A commercial jet. 24,000 feet. And the moment her father promised would finally arrive. 2 years and 6 months later. Wednesday. 3:12 p.m. Grand Ridge International Airport. The sky was so clear it almost looked fake. A deep, endless blue stretching across the horizon without a single cloud to interrupt it. The kind of weather pilots secretly love because it means one thing. Easy flight. No storms. No turbulence. No surprises. Flight 728 to Lakeshore City was a routine hop. 2 hours in the air. A route flown dozens of times every week. The aircraft, a 6-year-old narrow-body jet, had just completed a major inspection days earlier. Freshly cleared. Signed off by senior maintenance. In aviation terms, it was as safe could be. At Gate 19, Captain Renee Harper reviewed the flight plan one last time. 56 years old. Over 19,000 flight hours. Former military transport pilot. Known for being, by the book. You flew with Renee, you got home. Across from her sat First Officer Dylan Cross, 42. Former Navy fighter pilot. Calm under pressure. The kind of man who had landed on moving aircraft carriers at night and still slept fine afterward. They had flown this route together before. Clear all the way, Dylan said, scanning the weather display on his tablet. High pressure across the region. Smooth cruise. Let's keep it boring, Renee replied. In aviation, boring is perfect. Across the terminal, a small girl sat alone in a molded plastic chair. Unaccompanied minor. Name, Aria Maddox. Seat, 12A. Destination, Lakeshore City. Her backpack sat upright at her feet, zipped carefully. Inside were things no 11-year-old should logically own. A commercial jet systems manual. Engine failure procedure guides. Aeronautical charts. 3 spiral notebooks filled with handwritten calculations. And in a sealed plastic sleeve, protected from moisture, was her father's worn leather logbook. She wore the same oversized navy hoodie with the faded space patch stitched on the sleeve. The cuffs were frayed now. The fabric softer from years of washing. It still felt like armor. A gate agent knelt beside her. Ready to board, sweetheart? Aria nodded politely. Yes, ma'am. As passengers began lining up, she looked toward the aircraft through the glass. She didn't see a machine. She saw systems. Fuel loads. Weight distribution. Engine models. She heard her father's voice in her mind. Know what normal looks like. Boarding began. A flight attendant escorted her down the jet bridge. At the cockpit door, Aria hesitated. Excuse me, she said softly. May I say hello to the pilots? The flight attendant smiled. Quickly. The cockpit door opened. Dylan Cross looked down and saw a small girl with glasses and a serious expression standing in the doorway. Hi there, he said warmly. What's your name? Aria Maddox, sir. He nodded. Then she added. My father was Colonel Aaron Maddox. Call sign Viper. Dylan froze. Not visibly, but something in his posture changed instantly. You're Viper's daughter, he asked quietly. Yes, sir. Renee turned in her seat. She had heard that call sign too. Every pilot had. The man who flew broken aircraft and brought them back. The legend who died in a test flight accident. Dylan studied the hoodie patch. Recognition clicked into place. I met your father once, he said slowly. He gave a lecture on emergency recovery techniques. The man was different. Aria didn't smile. He taught me everything before he died. There was no childish tone in her voice. No exaggeration. Just fact. Renee glanced at Dylan. The weather was perfect. The flight straightforward. Would you like to sit in the jump seat for takeoff? Renee asked. Aria blinked once. Yes, ma'am. I would. Minutes later, she was buckled into the cockpit jump seat behind them, small hands resting calmly on her knees. She watched everything. Throttle advancement. Instrument checks. Call-outs. She didn't interrupt. Didn't fidget. She observed. The aircraft rolled down the runway and lifted smoothly into the sky. Positive rate. Gear up. Clean climb. Everything textbook. At 18,000 feet, autopilot engaged. Dylan ran the cruise checklist. All green. Behind them, Aria's eyes moved across the instrument panel. Airspeed steady. Fuel flow stable. Engine temperatures within normal range. She noticed patterns. Tiny variations. Not wrong. Just, slightly uneven. She didn't say anything yet. She waited. Because her father had taught her something more important than knowledge. Timing. At 23,000 feet, she finally spoke, softly. Sir, engine 2 fuel flow is fluctuating by about 4%. Dylan glanced down. It's within limits. Yes, sir, she replied calmly. Just not consistent. Renee smiled faintly. Good eye. She made a mental note. Probably nothing. Minor variation. Normal. Everything was still perfect. The sky was still clear. The aircraft leveled off at 24,000 feet. Smooth. Stable. Routine. For exactly 30 seconds. Then the left engine exploded. The sound didn't just echo. It punched through the cockpit. A violent metallic detonation ripped through the left side of the aircraft. The entire jet jolted sideways as if something enormous had slammed into it mid-air. The controls shook. The autopilot disconnected with a sharp warning chime. Then came the alarms. Red lights. Master caution. Fire warnings flashing like lightning inside the cockpit. Behind the cockpit door, passengers gasped as the aircraft lurched violently. Engine 1. Dylan shouted. We've lost Engine 1. Captain Renee Harper didn't waste a single second. Her hands moved before fear could catch up. Fire checklist. Execute. Dylan's fingers flew across switches with the muscle memory of thousands of simulator hours. Fuel cut off, closed. Engine fire handle, pulled. Fire suppression bottle, discharged. The cockpit filled with tension thick enough to feel. Seconds stretched. The red fire light flickered. Then went dark. Silence, except for the roar of the remaining engine and the wind rushing outside. Engine 1 secured, Dylan confirmed. Fire extinguished. The aircraft stabilized. Barely. One engine running. One engine dead. Serious, but survivable. Renee trimmed the rudder carefully, compensating for the uneven thrust. The jet steadied itself. We're returning, she said firmly. Declare emergency. Dylan grabbed the radio. Grand Ridge Center, Flight 728 declaring emergency. Engine failure, fire extinguished. Request immediate vectors back to departure airport. Air traffic control responded instantly. Flight 728, Roger emergency. Turn left heading 260. You are cleared direct Grand Ridge. Descend and maintain 16,000 feet. Emergency services standing by. Renee banked the aircraft smoothly. Controlled. Professional. Focused. This was exactly why jets had two engines. This was exactly why pilots trained. They would return. Land safely. Passengers would complain about delays. It would become a story people told at dinner. That's how it was supposed to end. Behind them, Aria didn't panic. She watched the engine gauges carefully. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. The first failure isn't always the real problem. She noticed something. A vibration spike. On engine 2. Small. But building. Captain, she said quietly. Not urgent. Just steady. Engine 2N1 vibration is rising. Dylan checked the panel. It's still within limits. Yes, sir, she replied. But it's accelerating. Renee's eyes flicked to the instrument cluster. The temperature needle trembled slightly. Then crept upward. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just wrong. The second engine didn't explode like the first. It began to die slowly. Thrust fluctuated. Temperature climbed. Compressor speed became unstable. The steady roar of power started to waver. Dylan's jaw tightened. Engine 2's not healthy. A warning tone chimed. Then another. Then, a deep mechanical grinding sound vibrated through the fuselage. And suddenly, the right engine failed. Not with a bang, but with a sickening collapse of sound. The cockpit went unnaturally quiet. No engine roar. No vibration. Just wind rushing across metal. The aircraft stopped being a jet. It became a glider. At 24,000 feet. Renee's breath caught for half a second. Then training snapped her back. Both engines out. Dylan's eyes scanned frantically. No thrust on either side. Attempting restart. He flipped switches. Ignition engaged. Fuel valves checked. Windmill restart sequence initiated. They waited. Nothing. No spool up. No recovery. The engines were destroyed. Dylan's voice lowered. Negative restart. Both engines dead. Silence filled the cockpit. Behind them, passengers could feel it now, the unnatural glide. The change in sound. The strange floating sensation. Renee pressed the transmit button. Mayday, mayday, mayday. Flight 728. Dual engine failure. We are gliding. 198 souls on board. Air traffic control hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then. Flight 728, confirm both engines lost. Affirmative. There was no panic in her voice. Just reality. Inside the cockpit, altitude ticked downward. 23,800 feet. 23,600. 23,400. Dylan quickly ran glide calculations. Distance to airport. Headwind component. Weight. Descent rate. He swallowed. We're not going to make it. The numbers didn't lie. They were short. Short by miles. Below them was open land. Fields. Scattered roads. No runway long enough. No options. Renee gripped the controls. 34 years of flawless flying. And now this. She turned slightly toward the jump seat. Aria, she said gently, voice tight. I need you to go back to your seat and buckle in. We're preparing for a forced landing. Aria didn't move. Her eyes were locked on the navigation display. Her fingers were already calculating in the air, invisible math only she could see. No, ma'am, she said calmly. The cockpit fell still. Dylan blinked. What? Aria's voice didn't shake. We can still make Grand Ridge. Renee stared at her. Not with this glide profile. Aria shook her head slightly. You're flying textbook. Dylan's brow furrowed. That's the procedure. Yes, sir, she replied. But textbook includes safety margins. We don't need margin. We need distance. The altimeter ticked down. 22,900 feet. Wind rushing louder. The little girl in the oversized hoodie looked at the runway icon on the map display. Then back at the captain. My dad trained me for this exact scenario. The words hung in the cockpit. Dual engine failure at cruise altitude. Renee's pulse pounded in her ears. The jet continued gliding. And for the first time since the engines died. Hope flickered. For 3 full seconds after the aircraft stopped, no one moved. Not in the cockpit. Not in the cabin. It was as if the entire world had paused to confirm something impossible. They were alive. Outside, emergency vehicles were already racing toward them, flashing lights reflecting off the silent fuselage. Fire trucks. Ambulances. Airport police. Inside the cockpit, Captain Renee Harper just stared at the runway ahead. Her hands were still wrapped around the controls. She had flown for 34 years. She had trained for engine failures, hydraulic failures, electrical failures. But she had never trained for the moment when an 11-year-old girl saved her aircraft. Dylan exhaled slowly, like he'd been holding his breath for the last 15 miles. "We stopped," he whispered. Renee nodded faintly. 200 feet left. Dylan let out a broken laugh that sounded half like a sob. 200 feet. Behind them, the cabin erupted. Passengers cried openly now, not from fear, but from relief. Some hugged strangers. Some dropped to their knees between seats. Others simply sat there shaking, staring at the seatbacks in front of them like they had just woken up from a nightmare. The lead flight attendant's voice came over the intercom, trembling but smiling through tears. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Grand Ridge." Applause exploded through the cabin. Not polite applause. Not normal, nice landing applause. This was survival applause. Raw. Shaking. Grateful. In the cockpit, Renee finally unstrapped herself and turned slowly toward the jump seat. Arya was still buckled in. Still calm. Her small hands rested neatly on her lap. Only now, for the first time, her fingers were trembling slightly. Renee studied her. "You knew," she said softly. Arya shook her head. "No, ma'am. You believed." That made Arya pause. "Yes," she said quietly. "I believed." Dylan turned fully in his seat. "How many times did you run that scenario?" Arya looked down for a second. 43 times. He swallowed. "In a real jet simulator?" "Yes, sir." "And your father trained you?" She nodded. "He said the moment would come." Renee's voice cracked slightly. "And you didn't freeze?" Arya's eyes glistened now. "I promised him I wouldn't." The cockpit door opened carefully. Sarah, the lead flight attendant, peeked in. "Captain, passengers are asking, who helped you?" Renee didn't hesitate. She stepped aside slightly and looked back at Arya. "This is Arya Maddox," she said clearly. "Daughter of Colonel Aaron Viperth Maddox." The name traveled like electricity down the aisle. Some passengers didn't recognize it. Some did. But everyone recognized what mattered. The child in the oversized hoodie had been in the cockpit. And they were alive. Within minutes, airport officials boarded the aircraft. Investigators. Fire crews. Medical teams checking for injuries. There were none. Not a single fatality. Not a single serious injury. Just shaken hearts. And a story that would spread faster than any news headline. Outside, as the cabin slowly emptied and passengers stepped onto the runway, some still crying, some laughing hysterically, many of them looked back at the aircraft. Then they looked at Arya. One elderly man removed his hat and nodded deeply at her. A young mother holding her toddler knelt down in front of her. "You saved my baby," she whispered. Arya didn't know what to say. She had never wanted attention. She had only wanted to keep a promise. Renee walked beside her toward the emergency vehicles. "You realize," the captain said gently, "what you did today isn't normal." Arya adjusted the sleeve of her hoodie. "It was training," she said simply. Dylan stopped walking and looked at her. "No," he said softly. "It was more than that." He glanced up at the silent aircraft. It was legacy. The wind moved lightly across the runway, tugging at the faded patch on her hoodie sleeve. For the first time since touchdown, Arya looked up at the sky. Not the cockpit. Not the runway. The sky. It was just as blue as the day her father stood with her beside the desert runway. She could almost hear him. "Trust the math. Preparation beats panic. Save them." Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. Not yet. Because the moment wasn't fully over. The promise had been kept. But the weight of it was only beginning to settle. And as reporters' vans began arriving beyond the airport fence, Aria Maddox realized something else. Her father had been right. The moment had come. And now the world would know. The sun was beginning to set when the runway finally cleared. The aircraft sat silent, surrounded by emergency vehicles and flashing lights that were no longer urgent, just procedural. Investigators moved carefully. Engineers examined the destroyed engines. News helicopters circled at a distance. But none of that mattered to Aria. She stood a few steps away from the plane, the oversized navy hoodie hanging loosely on her small frame. The same hoodie she had worn the day her father promised her the moment would come. The same hoodie she had worn at his funeral. And now, the hoodie she wore when 198 people walked away alive. Captain Renee Harper approached her quietly. No cameras. No reporters. Just pilot to pilot. Renee removed her cap. I've flown for 34 years, she said softly. I've trained thousands of hours for emergencies. Today, I would have put that aircraft into a field short of the runway. She looked Aria in the eyes. You changed that. Aria shifted slightly. No, ma'am. You flew it. Renee gave a small smile. You gave us the numbers. You gave us the courage to push past the book. Dylan joined them, his expression no longer shaken, just respectful. You didn't just remember procedures, he said. You understood them. Aria didn't respond immediately. She looked back at the aircraft. Then up at the sky. It wasn't me, she said quietly. It was my dad. The wind moved gently across the runway. For a moment, everything felt still. I heard his voice the whole time, she continued. Every calculation. Every speed change. He used to say that panic is louder than logic. You have to choose which one you listen to. Her voice trembled slightly now. I chose him. Renee felt her throat tighten. You know what his last transmission was? Dylan asked gently. Aria looked at him. He said, tell my daughter she's ready. Aria closed her eyes. She had heard those words before, from investigators, from her mother, but today they felt different. He hadn't just believed she would be ready someday. He knew. Passengers slowly approached her one by one. A father who hugged his teenage son tightly. A woman who had been praying in her seat the entire glide. A businessman who admitted he had already sent a goodbye text. They didn't treat her like a celebrity. They treated her like a miracle. One little girl around her own age stepped forward shyly. Were you scared? She asked. Aria thought for a moment. Yes, she answered honestly. But I was more prepared than scared. That little girl nodded like she understood something bigger than her years. As the crowd slowly dispersed and the evening light turned gold, Aria walked toward the edge of the runway alone. She sat down on the warm concrete. Pulled her father's worn leather logbook from her backpack. Opened it carefully. The pages smelled faintly of old ink and cologne. She found a blank space near the back. And for the first time, she wrote her own entry. Date, October 18th. Aircraft, commercial twin-engine jet. Event, dual-engine failure at 24,000 feet. Outcome, successful glide landing. Souls on board, 198. Notes, promise kept. Her pen paused. Then she added one more line. He was right. A tear finally slipped down her cheek. But she didn't wipe it away. She let it fall. Because this time, the sky hadn't taken someone from her. This time, the sky had given something back. Captain Renee called out gently from behind. They're arranging transportation for you to continue your trip. Your aunt's waiting. Aria closed the logbook carefully and stood up. Before walking away, she turned back toward the aircraft one last time. The engines were silent. But her father's training wasn't. Softly, almost in a whisper meant only for the wind, she said. I told you I'd be ready. A deep breath. I kept my promise, Dad. And somewhere beyond the fading light, beyond the clouds and endless blue, the moment he had felt coming for years had finally arrived. And she had answered it.